When Barron Trump walked into a high-end restaurant, he never expected that his MAGA hat would spark a public showdown. What happened next not only shocked the manager but left an entire city talking. It was a sunny afternoon in Los Angeles, the kind of day that tempts you to slow down and savor the moment. Barron Trump, now in his late teens, had just wrapped up a quiet morning of reading and decided to treat himself to lunch. He chose L.A. Terrace, a renowned restaurant known for its blend of sophistication and exclusivity, the kind of place where every table seemed to hold a story. Celebrities, CEOs, and influencers frequented the establishment, adding to its air of prestige. Barron had been there before, always enjoying the serene atmosphere and impeccable service. As he walked through the glass doors, he stood out, not just because of his height, but because of the bright red MAGA hat perched on his head. He wore it with ease, the way one wears something that feels natural to them. He wasn't trying to make a statement or provoke a reaction. It was simply a part of who he was. The hostess, a woman in her mid-30s with a polished demeanor, greeted him warmly and led him to a corner table. The restaurant wasn't crowded. A few diners sipped their wine, exchanging muted conversations, their voices blending with the soft instrumental music playing in the background. Barron opened the menu, his expression calm as he scanned for his favorite dish. At first, he didn't notice the subtle glances in his direction. A man at the next table nudging his partner, a couple of waitstaff whispering near the bar. But then, the manager emerged, a man in his mid-40s, dressed in a sharp suit and exuding an air of authority, strode briskly toward Barron's table. His face was tight with determination. "Excuse me," the manager said, his voice just loud enough to draw attention. "We have a policy against political apparel here. I'm going to have to ask you to remove the hat." Barron looked up, surprised but not rattled. He removed his earbuds, placing them neatly on the table. "I wasn't aware of any policy like that," he replied calmly. His voice was steady, respectful but firm. "It's written in our code of conduct," the manager insisted, gesturing vaguely toward the entrance. "We want this to be a neutral space for all guests." Barron tilted his head slightly, weighing his options. He glanced around the room. Some diners were pretending not to listen, their eyes focused on their plates, while others openly stared, waiting to see how the confrontation would unfold. "I'm not trying to cause any trouble," he said, his tone neutral. "I'm just here for lunch." The manager's stance stiffened. "You need to take the hat off, or I'll have to ask you to leave." For a brief moment, the room seemed to pause. Barron remained silent, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slight nod, he pushed his chair back and stood. "If that's how you feel," he said evenly, "then I'll leave." A heavy hush fell over the restaurant. The clinking of glasses and silverware had ceased. Eyes followed Barron as he picked up his belongings, left his untouched glass of water behind, and walked toward the exit. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He simply left. The door closed softly behind him, but the tension inside lingered, thick as smoke. Outside, Barron paused for a moment, letting the warm California breeze brush against his face. He adjusted his hat slightly, as if reaffirming his choice to wear it, and took a deep breath. He wasn't angry, frustrated maybe, but more than anything he felt disappointed. He had always been taught to treat people with kindness, even when disagreements arose, and this felt like a betrayal of that principle. Inside, the restaurant buzzed with quiet murmurs. A waiter leaned in to whisper to the manager, his voice barely audible over the low hum of conversation. "Do you think that was a good idea?" "That's him." The manager waved him off. "We can't make exceptions. If we let him stay, it sends a wrong message. This is my restaurant, and I'll run it as I see fit." Meanwhile, Barron walked a few blocks down to a small public park. He found an empty bench beneath the shade of a tall oak tree and sat down, exhaling deeply. His phone buzzed in his pocket, messages from friends who had already heard what happened. News traveled fast, especially when it involved someone with a last name like his. He glanced at the notifications, but didn't immediately respond. Instead, he looked around at the people in the park. Families playing on the grass, joggers passing by, an elderly couple feeding pigeons near a fountain. No one here cared about his hat, his name, or the controversy that had just unfolded. He let the moment sink in. This wasn't about a hat. It was about something bigger. The growing divide between people, the way assumptions were made based on appearances alone. And yet, as much as the encounter had frustrated him, Barron knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let it define him. He adjusted his hat once more, leaned back on the bench, and simply watched the world move around him. What happened next, however, would turn this quiet moment into something much bigger than he could have ever anticipated. Barron found an empty bench and sat down, pulling out his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he began typing. First, he messaged his mother, letting her know what had happened. Then, he sent a few texts to his close friends. He wasn't looking for sympathy, just clarity. Had he overreacted? Was the manager justified? Within minutes, replies started pouring in. One friend texted, "That's insane. They shouldn't have treated you like that." Another added, "You handled it better than I would have." As Barron scrolled through the messages, an idea began to form in his mind. He wasn't interested in revenge or turning this into a public showdown. Instead, he saw an opportunity, something constructive, something meaningful. If the restaurant wanted to avoid political statements, then why not highlight the importance of unity and understanding instead? Barron stood up, determination sparking in his eyes. He started making calls, his voice calm but filled with purpose. "Hey, I need your help with something," he said into the receiver. The first of many conversations that would set his plan in motion. The fallout begins. Back at L.A. Terrace, the atmosphere had shifted. Word of what had happened had already begun spreading through social media. As other diners shared their accounts online, they kicked out Barron Trump for a hat. One post read, accompanied by a blurry photo of the incident. Another chimed in, "So much for freedom of expression. Guess that doesn't apply at L.A. Terrace." At the bar, the manager scrolled through his phone. A knot formed in his stomach as he watched the comment section fill up. Not all of it supportive. "Let them talk," he muttered under his breath, trying to shake off the growing sense of regret. But deep down, he knew the situation was spiraling out of control. A bigger plan. By the time Barron returned home, the incident had already started making waves online. A few local influencers had picked up the story, their captions ranging from supportive to polarizing. Barron glanced at the posts briefly, but didn't dwell on them. He wasn't interested in fueling drama or dividing people further. Instead, he focused on what he could do to turn this negativity into something positive. Sitting at his desk, he pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook and began jotting down notes. He thought about the interactions he'd had that day, not just with the manager but with the people watching. The silent judgments, the curious stares. What could he do that would encourage dialogue rather than conflict? He wanted to challenge the divisiveness, but in a way that felt personal and impactful. Then the idea clicked almost out of nowhere. A fundraiser for unity. A public fundraiser. Not just any fundraiser, but one with a clear, unifying message. He envisioned an event that would support underprivileged communities, particularly focusing on creating safe spaces for open conversation and understanding. He picked up his phone and made a call. "Hi, this is Barron Trump. I need some advice on organizing a charity event." "Yes, it's urgent. Could we meet tomorrow?" The person on the other end of the line seemed surprised but quickly agreed. As the evening progressed, Barron's plan took shape. He drafted a proposal for the fundraiser, deciding to set it up right outside L.A. Terrace. The location mattered. It emphasized his message that even in places of conflict, unity could find its way. A close friend agreed to help with logistics, and within hours, the wheels were in motion. The backlash grows. Meanwhile, at the restaurant, the fallout was intensifying. The manager's decision was no longer a private matter. It had become a public debate. News outlets began reporting on the incident, quoting eyewitness accounts and analyzing the decision. Some articles painted Barron as a victim of intolerance, while others defended the restaurant's right to enforce its policies. The restaurant's social media pages were flooded with comments. Some users praised the manager for standing his ground, but others called for boycotts, arguing that the decision reeked of hypocrisy. One comment stood out: "So much for a neutral space. Kicking someone out isn't neutral, it's picking a side." The staff at LA Terrace could feel the tension. Regular customers started canceling reservations. The once bustling restaurant was noticeably quieter. The manager, who had initially felt confident about his stance, now found himself grappling with second thoughts. He told himself it would all blow over, that people would forget soon enough, but deep down he wasn't so sure. As night fell, Barron prepared for what was to come. He knew the fundraiser wouldn't erase the incident, nor would it change everyone's opinions overnight. But he hoped it could shift the focus towards something constructive. The world didn't need more shouting matches or deeper divisions. What it needed was moments of connection, even in the most unlikely circumstances. A movement takes shape. The following morning, the quiet block in front of LA Terrace began to transform. Trucks arrived one by one, unloading equipment as volunteers set up tables, banners, and a small stage. The air buzzed with energy, and Barron stood at the center of it all, overseeing the arrangements. Above the stage, a banner in bold letters read, "United we stand, building bridges, not walls." Barron had reached out to several organizations dedicated to community building, youth mentorship, and dialogue facilitation. This fundraiser wasn't just about raising money. It was about creating a space where people from different backgrounds could come together, listen, and understand one another. Food trucks lined the sidewalk, their vibrant aromas drawing in passers-by. A local jazz band set up near the entrance, warming up their instruments. Booths displaying artwork, literature, and resources for underprivileged communities filled the space, turning what had been a moment of conflict into a celebration of unity. By midday, the crowd started to gather. Families, young professionals, activists, and even a few familiar faces from social media arrived, eager to witness what had become the city's most talked-about event. Barron's speech. Standing before the microphone, Barron scanned the crowd. His voice, steady but filled with emotion, carried across the square. "Yesterday, I was asked to leave this restaurant because of a hat. That's okay. I respect their policies, even if I don't agree with them. But what struck me wasn't just being turned away. It was the bigger picture," he said, his tone calm but powerful. "We've become so quick to judge each other, to take sides, to shut down conversations before they even begin. That's not who we are. We can do better." A ripple of applause spread to the audience, growing louder as he continued. "This event isn't about me, and it's not about them." He gestured toward the restaurant. "It's about all of us. It's about finding ways to listen, to understand, and to come together, even when we disagree." The energy in the crowd shifted. People who had arrived simply out of curiosity now stood engaged, moved by his words. "The funds we raise today will go toward programs that foster dialogue and inclusion, because that's what we need more of, not more division, but more understanding." The crowd erupted into applause, this time louder and more unified. As Barron stepped off the stage, he moved through the crowd, shaking hands and thanking attendees personally. His composure and thoughtful words resonated deeply, leaving a lasting impression on those present. Inside LA Terrace. Meanwhile, inside LA Terrace, the atmosphere was entirely different. The manager stood at the window, watching the event unfold. He hadn't expected Barron to respond in this way, and it left him conflicted. Some of his staff had stepped outside, drawn to the energy of the event. A few had even joined the fundraiser, unable to resist the pull of the lively music and sense of camaraderie. One waiter, who had been there the day before, returned to the bar and spoke quietly. "You should go out there. Talk to him." The manager stiffened. "This isn't my fight," he muttered. "Maybe not," the waiter replied, but it's definitely your chance." The manager didn't respond, but something in his expression softened. He poured himself a glass of water and continued watching as the crowd outside grew. Something about the scene tugged at him, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge until now. The event goes viral. As the day wore on, the fundraiser outside LA Terrace became the talk of the town. Social media exploded with live streams, photos, and hashtags like #BuildingBridges and #UnitedWeStand, all praising Barron's poise and the positive message he was spreading. The event attracted more than just locals. News crews arrived, capturing the vibrant energy of the crowd and Barron's powerful speech. Inside the restaurant, it was another story. The once bustling dining room now sat eerily quiet. Tables that were typically reserved weeks in advance were empty. The few patrons who did arrive seemed distracted, frequently glancing toward the fundraiser outside, as if they were missing out on something meaningful. The manager tried to focus on his work, but the growing tension among his staff was impossible to ignore. A server cautiously approached him. "Some customers have been asking about the event," she said. "They're saying it looks incredible, and maybe we should go out there." The manager's jaw tightened. He didn't respond immediately. He had spent the past 24 hours convinced that he had done the right thing, that sticking to his policies was the only choice. But now, as he watched the community gather outside, talking, laughing, and finding common ground, he wasn't so sure anymore. A moment of decision. As the event continued just beyond the restaurant's doors, the manager found himself at a crossroads. Would he hold on to his decision, or would he step outside and face the young man he had turned away? Barron had already transformed a moment of exclusion into a movement of unity. But would the manager be willing to listen, just as Barron had encouraged others to do? As the cameras rolled and the city watched, one thing was certain. This story wasn't over yet. The manager's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he retreated to his office, closing the door behind him. He sank into his chair, his eyes fixed on his computer screen, where dozens of emails flooded in. Complaints from customers, cancellation notices, scathing critiques from local media outlets. The backlash was overwhelming, and no amount of justification could drown out the growing sense of unease settling in his chest. Among the messages, one email stood out. It was from a regular customer, someone who had always been cordial and supportive. He clicked it open, and as he read, the words hit harder than he expected. "I've always loved LA Terrace, but yesterday's incident was deeply disappointing. Kicking someone out for their personal beliefs isn't the neutrality you claim to stand for. It's divisive. I hope you'll find a way to make this right." The manager leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. Was he wrong? Had his decision really been about neutrality, or was it about something else entirely, something he didn't want to admit to himself? A turning point. Meanwhile, outside, the event had reached its peak. A local jazz band played on stage, their melodies weaving through the warm evening air. Children laughed as they painted murals at an art booth, their hands covered in bright colors. Donation boxes overflowed with contributions, a testament to the overwhelming support for the cause. And at the center of it all was Barron Trump. He moved effortlessly through the crowd, shaking hands, listening to people's stories, and posing for selfies. There was no arrogance in his demeanor, no attempt to stir controversy. Just a young man who radiated a quiet confidence, the kind that comes from knowing you're doing something that truly matters. As the sun dipped lower, casting a golden glow over the gathering, a buzz rippled through the crowd. All eyes turned toward the restaurant. The manager had just stepped outside, a step forward. He hesitated on the steps, adjusting his tie nervously. His gaze swept over the sea of people, then landed on Barron. For a brief moment, he considered turning back. But something in the air, something about the energy of the moment, compelled him to move forward. The crowd parted slightly, their chatter fading as they watched the two men approach each other. Barron saw him coming, and instead of stepping back, instead of holding on to resentment, he did something that caught many off guard. He smiled. A small, polite smile, the kind that disarmed even the harshest critic. He extended his hand. The manager hesitated for a split second, uncertainty flickering across his face. But then he reached out and shook it. "I'd like to talk," he said quietly, his voice almost drowned out by the surrounding noise. "Of course," Barron replied, gesturing toward a quieter spot near the edge of the event. A conversation that changed everything. They walked together, the crowd watching intently but respectfully, giving them space. Near the outskirts of the event, where the music and chatter were softer, they stopped. The manager's face, usually composed and commanding, now carried a hint of unease. He glanced at the crowd behind them, then back at Barron. "I need to start by saying that I didn't handle yesterday well," the manager began, his voice low but steady. Barron remained silent, listening. "I thought I was doing what was best for my restaurant, for my staff," the manager continued, exhaling deeply. "But I realize now that I made a mistake. I judged you, and I acted out of fear, not fairness." Barron nodded, his expression calm and encouraging. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong," he said after a moment. "Thank you for saying that." The manager let out a breath, as if a weight had been lifted. He glanced around, taking in the energy of the event, the people who had come together instead of being driven apart. "Watching what you've done here today, it's humbling," he admitted. "You could have retaliated, turned this into a public attack on my business. But instead, you created something positive. That's not something most people would do." Barron smiled faintly. "I don't think the world needs more anger or division," he said. "What happened yesterday could have just added to the noise. But I wanted to show that there's a better way." The manager nodded slowly, processing the words. "You did," he said after a pause. "And I'd like to support what you're doing here. If there's a way for me or the restaurant to contribute, I'd be happy to." Barron considered this for a moment before responding. "I think the best way to contribute is to reflect on how we treat each other. Policies are important, but they should never come at the expense of kindness and understanding," he said. Then, with a slight smile, he added, "Maybe LA Terrace could host an event like this one, something that brings people together instead of pushing them apart." The manager blinked, clearly caught off guard by the suggestion. For a moment, he seemed unsure, but then a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I think that's a great idea," he said. "Let's make it happen." And this time, when they shook hands, it was different. There was no hesitation, no unspoken resentment, just genuine warmth. The crowd, sensing the resolution, erupted into applause. And as the evening faded into night, it was clear that something had shifted. Not just for Barron Trump, not just for the manager of LA Terrace, but for everyone who had witnessed what had just unfolded. Because in a world too often divided, a simple handshake had reminded people that understanding is always possible, if only we are willing to listen. The crowd began to applaud, but it wasn't the kind of forced, polite clapping one might expect. It was genuine and heartfelt, a sign that everyone recognized the significance of the moment. As the event wound down, Barron took the stage one last time, his expression filled with gratitude and purpose. He looked out at the crowd, his voice steady as he spoke. "We all make mistakes, but what matters is how we choose to grow from them. Today wasn't just about raising money. It was about proving that even when we disagree, we can still find common ground. Thank you for showing that unity isn't just possible. It's necessary." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices filling the air with hope and energy. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the city as Barron stood with his friends and family, watching as the last of the attendees trickled out. But they weren't just leaving with memories of a well-organized event. They carried something more, a message of understanding, resilience, and change. This story serves as a reminder that conflicts, whether big or small, don't have to end in bitterness or division. By choosing grace, understanding, and proactive solutions, we can transform even the most challenging moments into opportunities for connection and growth. And on that evening in Los Angeles, Barron Trump had done just that.